Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Jeff Rock, and welcome to another D. Hilton Associates webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing the 2024 SERP and split dollar survey results. A lot of great information, a lot of good things to cover. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce joining us today, Debbie Hilton. How are you, Debbie?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Jeff.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here. Also joining us today is Brian Kidwell. How are you, Brian?
Doing fantastic.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, guys. Debbie, why don't you go ahead and kick us off here? Tell us a little bit about what is a SERP?
A SERP is a supplemental executive retention or retirement plan. It's a non-qualified deferred compensation plan. And what I mean by non-qualified is that unlike a 401k or a pension plan, these plans are designed and put in place for select executives. These plans are not subject to ERISA, so that allows the organization to be very discriminatory in who they put a SERP in place for. So what we see in the credit union industry are SERP plans for the most valuable of executives, and these plans are different in that each plan is put in place as an agreement between the credit union and each executive. SERPs are also extremely flexible. One size does not fit all, and what we see are benefits that are specific to the credit union's needs as well as the executive's needs. So we're talking a little bit more about what we found out from our survey results, and I'll let Brian go over those in more detail.
We do want to talk a little bit about typical SERP plan objectives that come into place for high-performing credit unions. So a lot of boards will ask, why do we need to put a SERP in place? For one, attracting talent from the executive recruiting perspective, we find that SERP plans are a great way to either attract that talent, bring talent from other industries such as technology is one of the big ones where we're competing with equity, retaining that talent, and then obviously motivating them to perform. Restoration of retirement plan shortfalls is something a lot of boards don't think about, but it's impacting a lot of executives, and that's where the IRS 415 limits are basically penalizing the executive from being able to participate in a credit union's qualified plan. Obviously, best practice design, being competitive to peers is important. One of the big ones is pay philosophy, and we talk a lot about that at the company. Credit unions establishing a pay philosophy, and that makes it so much easier for the organization to reward their talent.
The SERP takeaways, and this survey is in our 20th year, I believe 20 years, correct, Brian?
Yes.
SERPs, what we have found over the years are really more important now than ever before. And we see these SERPs being offered and negotiated at hire and typically implemented within a year or 2 years of an executive start date. We see multiple layers of SERPs. And what I mean by that is that not only are SERPs in place for the CEOs in the industry, they also are in place for EVPs, VPs, and now we're starting to see credit unions really design SERPs and put them in place with succession planning in mind. So they could be 1, 2, or 3 layers deep. One size does not fit all. I said that earlier. And what I mean by that is that you don't necessarily put a SERP in place for an executive that might be earlier in their career versus later in their career. You don't see one size SERP for executives that are in one position versus another position. And you see a difference in SERP design between credit unions of asset size. So the customization of these plans is important in terms of retention and attracting the talent as well as rewarding the pay philosophy of the credit union. The other thing that we've found out over the years from our SERP survey is that annual reviews are incredibly important. The credit union should communicate, just as you do with the 401k plans you have in place, you should communicate to the executive the value of the benefit on an annual basis. So frequent reviews as well as necessary revisions as the credit union's organization chart, as the executive's value, as the peer and the industry changes are also very important.
So I think you make a really good point about the fact that when I think of a SERP, I always think of a retirement plan, but it's also baked in as a retention process, being able to attract and retain and keep that top talent and keep them happy.
If the SERP is designed appropriately, the SERP can be valuable over decades, but it really is key to have those regular reviews and peer benchmarking.
Well, it's something that we've seen a lot of lately. I know in our executive recruiting practice, we have executives that are looking at positions, and you'll ask them, "What do you have today?" And they know they have something, but they can't really tell you anything about it. And I think that goes hand in hand with that idea of annual reviews, both with the board of directors and with the individual executives, to make sure they understand the benefit that they have and the value of the benefit. Otherwise, the retention mechanism that you've put in place is not working if they don't know what it is.
Yeah, perception is reality. If they don't perceive it as being as valuable as it is, okay, well, I'm gonna walk away from that and realize on the back end, whoops, I shouldn't have done that.
That's correct.
So let's talk a little bit about the survey results. It is our 20th anniversary study, so we have a ton of historical data to pull from when talking about these results. We did have a 53% overall response rate. We sent out to almost 1,900 credit unions. That's basically all credit unions over 100 million, 965 back. You can see the response rate broken out, our strongest response being in the larger asset categories, where we have just a whole lot of data, and that allows us to slice and dice it. Also makes it very meaningful in terms of the confidence level and the accuracy of the information. Reasons for offering a SERP, and Debbie kind of touched on some of this early on when we started discussing retention incentive. The retention piece, 95% of responses, it's definitely being used as a retention incentive. Also to elevate that retirement benefit, again, restore those qualified plan shortfalls. So to try to make that executive as whole as possible to what others in the organization are receiving. And one we've seen increase, and we've been hearing it really 2023, this last year, I know that a lot of our work has been in the succession planning area, either boards wanting to extend a CEO's employment out further, either because the CEO wants to work longer, or the succession strategy, the number twos are not quite ready. But succession planning has been a big topic. And you're going to see that when you look at non-CEO SERPs that have been put in place. And last time we did this and talked about it before we did the survey, we were expecting non-CEOs to be substantially higher, and the data actually did show that. SERP plan usage for CEOs, you can see this broken out by assets. We put a little a plus percentage up there just to give you an idea. So anywhere between 8% increases to 11% increases. Really no surprise if you're looking for a CEO today, it's highly likely that if they don't have a SERP, they're going to be asking for a SERP or needing a SERP. And actually, the likelihood they already have some sort of SERP plan in place is highly likely to begin with. So that's something we talk to boards a lot about as we're talking about CEO searches and even non-CEO searches, is you're probably going to need to think about doing some sort of retention mechanism, retention and retirement mechanism to be able to recruit talent. And you can see overall, just 10 years ago, only 41% of credit union CEOs had SERPs in place. Now it's 67%. So it's definitely a benefit that is very, very prominent in the industry.
And that's in credit unions greater than 100 million.
Greater than 100 million.
If you go back to 2000, when we first started the survey, it was typically only a benefit for CEOs. It tended to be a benefit primarily focused on restoration of retirement plan shortfalls. And overall, it was still around 40% that had a SERP back in 2000. We really saw a pickup in the use of SERPs after the Great Recession back in 2008, 2009.
Let's take a look at, let's talk about non-CEO executives, because this was the area where we expected to see these numbers significantly higher than credit union CEOs in terms of change. And you can see we put it up here 2015 to 2023. And you look at the billion plus group up 16%. And so this is credit unions that offer a SERP plan to at least one or more non-CEO executives. And you can see that in the $1 billion plus, that's at 72%. And in the 600 to 999, you can see that's 59%. Obviously, it trails off the lower that you get in assets. A lot of that just has to do with affordability to be able to do the SERP plan for multiple executives. But we're going to continue as we do this survey again. I fully expect that we'll see these numbers continue to rise. And that's what we're seeing in our own SERP practice is a lot more interest in putting those plans in place for those non-CEO executives, again, either because of succession or retention.
And especially how difficult it is to recruit some of these top talent. If you find some of your bench strength is worth investing in, invest in them. It seems like an opportunity to really say, hey, this is how much we think that you're going to be able to move through this organization. Here's an opportunity, and you present a SERP opportunity.
It also is impacted by the difference in organization chart today versus in the past. Credit unions, when you look at the top talent, are far more likely today to recruit outside the industry at the top levels. And in order to bring those people into the not-for-profit industry that credit unions are, you've got to be able to offer a competitive retirement package. So without equity, or these SERP benefits help to bring in and attract that talent from outside the industry, bridge the gap, right?
So which non-CEO executives are most likely to have a SERP plan? The orange bar is the top finance executive. Typically, that is the most likely if they're outside of the CEO to have a SERP plan in place. But you'll see other areas like the green bar is lending. The blue bar is actually the dark blue bar is top IT executive. And I think that speaks to Debbie's point. You know, when we talk about IT executives, it used to be when we would do executive searches for IT executives, they would say, well, I need someone who knows the Scimitar system. They would always go to the core system. Now we're looking for executives that are fintech type executives, especially in security is one of the big ones. And as Debbie mentioned, that's obviously playing a lot in terms of bringing in executives from out of industry, people who have a talent that can go across not just financial services, but other sectors as well.
I think that when credit unions look at offering SERPs to other executives, they ask two questions. They ask about succession planning. Is this a rising star we want to keep in the organization? And they ask the question, if this executive was going to go somewhere else and or if we were going to hire another executive to fill this role, what would it take? Where would they go? And what kind of package would we need? So those are key questions, I think, that drive the use of SERPs for non-CEOs.
One of the things to think about when you're designing the SERP is the approach that you want to take. A focus on pay for performance is really a key piece, and we at D. Hilton talk a lot about that, both in our SERP practice as well as in our compensation practice. A pay for performance approach, one thing that we have seen is defined contribution approaches have gone out of favor since 2007. In what has been taking its place is either a defined benefit approach or a combination approach, and we have some definitions up here. And I think this speaks to some of the changes that we saw in 2007, right, Debbie?
Oh, no, there's no doubt about it. I mean, prior to 2007, 2008, the majority of non-qualified deferred comp plans across the credit union industry, as well as in the for-profit industry, were established as defined contribution, where organizations put up a specific amount of money or offered a specific amount of equity. And whatever that equity was worth or that the earnings were on in that account, that's what the executive would receive in the future. With the Great Recession and the decline in earnings, we saw basically a reduction in the golden handcuff approach that a defined contribution plan offers. So instead, credit unions have focused more on promising an executive in exchange for working to a specific retirement date or upon approaching perhaps a anniversary date, that they would be receiving either a fixed dollar amount or even better, a percentage of final compensation. That way, the executive could really and truly plan a future retirement benefit around that distribution event, as well as knowing that they were going to receive a benefit that was commensurate with their work efforts. So defined benefit design has absolutely grown in value. A combination approach is still very much used, and that's a situation where the credit union has a specific dollar amount perhaps that they invest, but they put some type of floor guarantee on the minimum benefit that the executive would receive in the future. We see this used a lot with incoming executives before their tenure or their value has perhaps been established. So these three approaches are still in use, but the defined benefit approach is more in line with the pay for performance philosophy.
In terms of distributions, this is another important aspect of what we see as really strong plans. Multiple distributions throughout their employment, and when you're hiring, we are seeing obviously as we've had a huge wave of baby boomers retiring, we are filling those ranks with younger executives, and younger executives putting those small carrots in place is really key. So if you're telling someone who you recruited in who's 40 that they're going to have to wait to 65 to see a payment, it's just not as effective. And that's the beauty of these plans is they're so customized. You can ask questions like, when are they going to have a child going to college? Is always these milestones in life where they are going to have a major expense, and how can we kind of put those carrots in place, obviously to help that executive, but also make sure that we're kind of planning ahead. Same goes for succession. So a lot of boards don't think about that, but we do a search. We have some internal executives. We have some external executives. Well, we decide that the external executive is the best for the organization. How do we make sure that we've put those benefit distributions in place that we don't have an exodus of our executive talent, that we're not selected for the position? Same thing with succession. How do we make sure that if we're going to invest 5 years into an executive with the idea of them taking over the CEO or other C-suite position, how do we make sure we don't lose that executive in year 4 and all of a sudden back to square one? So multiple distributions is really a key piece to a successful plan.
The other thing I would, just some perspective, going back to early 2000, it was very normal and typical to have a single SERP distribution at normal retirement age. And that too has evolved. And what we see for incoming CEOs, for instance, that are in their mid-40s, early 50s, it's not unusual to see 3 or 4 more distributions throughout their career.
Plan type. So this is, we asked what type of SERP plan credit unions have in place. We still see 457F SERP plans as the leading design approach, and you see that especially as you go up in the asset size band. So when you look at, say, $1 billion plus, 71% have a 457F plan. There are other types of plan designs. So 457, when we talk about SERPs, it's not. There's one plan design would be a 457F plan, which is owned and controlled by the credit union. And a lot of credit unions, that's one of the benefits or the reasons they do like 457Fs is its flexibility and the fact that they own and control the plan. Loan regime split dollar plans are another type of plan that we do see in the industry. In that situation, the credit union makes a loan to the executive, so the executive can purchase life insurance. It is owned by the executive, and the executive basically collateralizes the life insurance policy over to the credit union. These can be very, very complex plans, very hard to understand. They can be effective. So we do, especially with younger executives, we will look at using a combination approach of 457F and loan regime split dollar plans. So there is certainly in certain cases a benefit to using loan regime, and especially when you use it in combination with the 457F, you get a little bit of the best of both worlds is what we found. But again, you typically have to have a younger executive to make those plans work. There is also endorsement split dollar, which we don't see as much. That's where the credit union actually owns the policy and endorses it over to the executive at a time in the future. And then other types of plans typically would include like a 457B plan, which you don't see as much in credit unions because they still have those IRS 415 limits imposed on them. So you typically are going to see 457Fs as the predominant approach.
Right. Another type of other plan that we occasionally see are specific plans set up to restore the shortfall or the deficit in a 401k account. So it could just be very specifically a 401k restoration plan. That would come under IRS Code 457F, but it specifically is used to restore that shortfall in the 401k plan or in a pension plan. Sometimes we see it in a pension plan as well. 4 times as many of our executive recruiting candidates have defined contribution plans versus defined benefit plans. So what this means is that when candidates call D. Hilton and apply for positions in the industry, C-suite positions, they usually share with us whether or not they have a SERP in place. And if they do, they tell us what type of plan it is. They frequently share the documentation with us. What we have found for the last 4 or 5 years is that executives with plans that are defined contribution in design, meaning they do not have a specific guaranteed benefit, or they feel like they have a benefit that has not kept up with their career, are more likely to be applying for opportunities in the industry. So in other words, the defined contribution approach appears to us from a recruiting perspective to have less retention associated with it.
Let's talk about total compensation. So when you're designing a plan, you can do fixed dollar amounts. You can obviously
Many
do
different
a
ways.
defined contribution where it's based on performance. One of the things that we find that really works well at sticking with a credit union's pay for performance philosophy is tying the SERP plan to a percentage of average total compensation. And when we say total compensation, we're talking about base and variable compensation. And that used to not be the case. They used to tie these plans to base compensation. Why total compensation? Most credit unions are moving more towards a pay-for-performance culture instead of just increasing base salary. And Jeff, you could speak to this, that more and more credit unions are increasing the variable pay targets.
Absolutely.
And most boards are taking that philosophy that I don't mind paying more for the performance of the credit union. So as you're leaning more on variable pay for your pay for performance philosophy, the same is true on the SERP side. So if you look at the median, the 50th percentile, you'll see that the average or the median target percentage of final compensation is 70%. And what does that mean? That means that when the SERP plan at typically retirement age, the plan is trying to fulfill 70% of whatever that total compensation number is. Now, when we say 70%, what is included in that? Social Security. Most credit unions usually look at Social Security, what the executive's going to get in Social Security as an offset to the 70%. Any split dollar distributions that they're going to receive in retirement is typically an offset. Any previous SERP distributions is an offset, as well as what the credit union has put into the 401k. And so when you kind of put all these together, you then basically come up with, what percentage that SERP plan needs to fulfill to be able to get to that 70% target. Debbie,
And it's usually an average, right? So it's typically the final 3 or 5 years average cash compensation. So in the calculation, you're going to use base salary and you're going to use the bonus cash compensation. PTO isn't included. Car allowance is not included. But this allows us to easily compare on an apples to apples basis what a benefit um, each executive has within an organization. We're actually can benchmark between different peer groups. It allows us to compare what's typical and normal between the average employee in an organization, the C-suite. Using this formula approach gives us the data set that we need in order to begin the design process. So since I've worked with SERPs, which are a couple of decades now, we've seen many changes to these plans. And they are changed based upon the credit union's need to change the plan, but they also, we find, have been changed over the years because of regulatory reasons. So the typical reasons credit unions revise a SERP are to revise a target retirement date, extending a date, motivating an executive to work beyond a specific target date, growth in mergers, modifying the peer group, executives moving from one job description or position in an organization to another, expansion of responsibilities. That's incredibly important. A design change, a revision in original design assumptions. So you may start, and we see this a lot with executives that are promoted within an organization. You may see an executive's assumed compensation grow as they are promoted, let's say, for instance, from a COO position to a CEO position. That would mean perhaps a change in the SERP design. And then because state charter credit unions remain subject to excise tax, we do see credit unions revise the SERP terms to mitigate that excise tax impact to the organization.
And when it comes to revisions, should it be something that you look in annually? Should it be triggered events? How do you kind of design that process?
I think that the regular review process, if a credit union is, at our suggestion, reviewing these plans each year, just as they do a review of total cash compensation, one of the questions from a due diligence perspective should be, are there any changes that we should consider in our SERP design? We don't see them happen on an annual basis, but asking that question or making it a question that's asked annually is a good way to ensure viability.
SERP plan assumptions typically included, there's a whole lot that you have to think about when you're putting these plans in place. And here are some examples. There's obviously a lot on this chart, but everything from when they were hired, what's their title, what's their value to the organization, their cash compensation, what do you think the projections are, what are going to be the projection assumptions for their compensation into the future, retirement benefit plans. So if we have a 457B, we have pension, 401k, all of those different things have to come into play. Any existing type of SERP plan, Social Security, and then credit union factors like the organizational chart. Where do we want this executive to grow into the organization? How long do we realistically want the executive to be employed for the organization? Some board members say I want the executive to stay as long as they want. Some organizations or credit unions adopt a more planned transition. So we'll often and same thing with executives, individual executives. We talk to executives all the time that want to leave at 60. They want to retire earlier. And you can plan these, take these plans and design them, obviously not just around what the executive wants, but what the credit union, what's best for the credit union.
When we are engaged to design and or evaluate a SERP, one of the first things we do is we ask the credit unions to provide us with all of this information. So we really need a deep dive into the data specific to each executive. And then from there, we design the SERP that might be most meaningful to you, Jeff, or to you, Brian, versus a generic SERP
There's
off
a
the
canned
shelf.
approach.
We do not. Yeah, there's no. The canned approach we know does not work.
Does not work.
Does not work. So, 5 steps for a successful SERP program. We're often asked, how long does it take to put a SERP in place? How long should we plan or allocate? So, we recommend that the credit unions spend about 4 to 6 months on the due diligence in order to educate everyone on the committee, to gather the data, to allow us to come up with multiple options and scenarios for each client, and then to work with the credit union's attorney. And you do need a specialist in this area to draft the agreement, and then to move forward and get the SERP implemented, presented to the board for approval. Really what you need are these 5 steps. So first you determine the need for a SERP, and that's through the design process. And then based upon what you know to be the baseline case and peer information, you custom design the executive's SERP, and then you implement and choose the type of funding that's most appropriate. If you have an executive that's closer to retirement, then it's really hard to find a split dollar approach that's going to work with somebody that's, closer to retirement versus having a long runway. Not every funding option is appropriate for every executive and or for every credit union. And then ongoing SERP administration and peer benchmarking. Making sure that you've got all the I's dotted and T's crossed, and that you've got a SERP policy in place that the board has approved, that the credit union's investment policy has been, if needed, adjusted to incorporate the appropriate SERP funding. You need to make sure that you've got, from a regulatory perspective, all of the documentation that you need to document why you put in place a SERP for each executive. And then you need to, within the SERP, within the board's regular and review process going forward, through a policy approach, document what steps would be taken in the future to ensure compliance with both NCUA as well as the IRS codes, and to make sure that you've got documents and policy in place that are going to satisfy the regulators, that you have a regular review process with each executive for viability. So these 5 steps are what we have found over the 25 plus years we've been doing this, that we feel are key to successful SERP and administration. Best way to protect your executive assets are what you see on this slide. I think that it's very, very important that every board member understand what a SERP is, not just a compensation committee necessarily, but every board member. So ongoing education on all things executive comp at the board level is important. We want frequent plan reviews, third-party validation. I think that third-party validation is incredibly important, because that way you have an understanding of whether or not your SERP is going to fulfill the target objectives that you originally set. We hear a lot about this. We spend a lot of time doing evaluations of SERPs that were very viable 10 or 15 years ago and now have lost that viability. Onboarding new board members. One of the things that executives worry about most, and that we find can be disruptive, is turnover is ongoing at the board level, just as it is within the C-suite. So bringing new board members up to speed on all things compensation, but especially the SERP, because it is more complex, and letting them know how it fits into the total comp picture is important. I think that the SERP review process also should include honest conversations regarding succession planning, not only at the CEO level, but also the board with the CEO about other senior executives, and then making sure that the credit union communicates annually with the executives what value this additional compensation benefit is to them and how important it is for them to use this as part of their long-term financial plan.
And the start of all this is the ongoing education piece of it, which you can forward this webinar to start that process, get the boards to understand.
Well, and that's a good point. I mean, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to SERP plans. So we're certainly going to probably have people who watch the webinar, they're going to have more questions. We are going to be doing more webinars in diving into more specific parts of a SERP program, because there is a lot. So, I would expect more 30 to 45-minute webinars that we have planned in the future that are going to dive into a lot more of the do's and don'ts, the specifics of design, things of that nature. We do also have here our contact information. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to Debbie and/or I, and we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. And if you would like us to do a Zoom meeting with your board of directors or your management team and kind of talk through what we're seeing in the industry, we're always happy to accommodate.
Yeah. The one other thing I would say is that each November we do host a symposium here in the Woodlands, Texas. We call it the Total Rewards Symposium, and it's all things compensation. And in a day and a half, you not only learn about SERPs, but you learn about base compensation determination, variable pay components, executive recruiting, succession planning. So that also could be a tremendous resource for bringing members of the board or the C-suite up to speed on credit union compensation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for joining us. We do sincerely appreciate it. Debbie, Brian, thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot, so I'm looking forward to more on the horizon as we learn a little bit and deeper dive into this. Guys, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you on the next one.